Before we begin, subscribe if you're drawn to the cases that refuse to fade, the lies that unravel slowly, and the quiet details that eventually scream the loudest. Like the video if you believe the smallest clue can break the biggest story. And comment below, when does suspicion become certainty? On Christmas Eve morning in 2002, Modesto, California felt ordinary. The air was cold but not bitter. Holiday decorations lined quiet suburban streets. Inside a modest home in the upscale Covina Avenue neighborhood, 27-year-old Laci Peterson, 8 months pregnant, was preparing for the final stretch before her due date. She and her husband, Scott Peterson, were expecting a son. They had already chosen a name, Connor. By the afternoon, Laci was gone. Scott told police he had spent the morning fishing alone at the Berkeley Marina, nearly 90 miles away. He said Laci had been home when he left. When he returned later that day, the house was quiet. Her car was in the driveway. Her purse was inside. Their dog had been found wandering the neighborhood with a muddy leash still attached. There were no signs of forced entry. No overturned furniture. No shattered glass. No screams reported. Just absence. The disappearance triggered immediate concern. Laci was 8 months pregnant. She was known to be excited about motherhood. Friends and family described her as steady, warm, and organized. She had been planning Christmas dinner. There was no reason for her to leave without telling anyone. Within hours, the case was no longer local. It was national. Cameras gathered outside the Peterson home. Volunteers formed search parties. Flyers went up across Modesto. News anchors repeated her name. Pregnant. Missing. Christmas Eve. Scott stood before microphones and pleaded for her safe return. His voice was measured. Controlled. He said he loved his wife. He asked for help. He thanked volunteers. But as days passed, small cracks began to show. Investigators learned Scott had told Laci he was going golfing that morning, not fishing. The last-minute shift in plans raised questions. So did the distance. Why drive nearly 90 miles alone on Christmas Eve to fish in freezing water? Police searched the Berkeley Marina. They searched the bay. They searched the house. And then came something that didn't sit right. Detectives discovered Scott had been having an affair. Her name was Amber Fry. She was a massage therapist from Fresno. She believed Scott was single. More than that, she later told investigators that Scott had claimed to have lost his wife. He had allegedly told her he was a widower. The timeline stunned investigators. Scott reportedly introduced himself to Amber in early November 2002, just weeks before Laci vanished. By mid-December, according to Amber, he told her this would be the first Christmas without his wife. Laci was still alive when he said that. When news of the disappearance broke, Amber contacted police. She realized she had been deceived. And she agreed to cooperate. Under police supervision, Amber recorded phone calls with Scott. In those conversations, while search teams combed fields and divers scanned murky waters, Scott spoke calmly to his girlfriend. He downplayed the media frenzy. He claimed he was in Paris watching fireworks on New Year's Eve, when in reality he was standing at a candlelight vigil for his missing pregnant wife. The contrast was chilling. Public perception shifted. Sympathy hardened into suspicion. Still, suspicion is not proof. Weeks turned into months. No body. No crime scene. No weapon. Just inconsistencies, phone records, and an affair. Investigators began reconstructing Scott's movements on December 24th. He said he left home around 9:30 a.m. He drove to his warehouse. He sent emails. He made phone calls. Then he drove to Berkeley Marina to fish. But detectives questioned the spontaneity of that trip. He had purchased a fishing license just days earlier. He had bought a small aluminum boat weeks before. One Laci's family claimed she didn't even know existed. When police searched the warehouse, they found homemade concrete anchors. Only one anchor remained intact. There were signs others may have been made. Concrete dust lingered. It wasn't proof of anything on its own. But in a case with no visible violence, every detail carried weight. As media attention intensified, so did scrutiny. Scott dyed his hair. He grew a goatee. He purchased a new vehicle and carried large amounts of cash. He had his brother's ID, camping gear, multiple cell phones. On April 18, 2003, just 4 months after Laci disappeared, Scott Peterson was arrested near a golf course in La Jolla, California. Police believed he was preparing to flee. 2 days earlier, on April 13, 2003, a couple walking along the shoreline near Point Isabel Regional Shoreline Park in the San Francisco Bay had discovered the remains of a late-term male fetus. The next day, the decomposed body of a woman washed ashore nearby. Dental records confirmed what everyone feared. It was Laci. And the unborn child. The location was devastating. It was near the very marina where Scott claimed to have gone fishing the morning she vanished. The prosecution would later argue that Scott had planned the murder carefully. That he killed Laci in their home, transported her body in his boat, and disposed of her in the bay using homemade anchors. The defense insisted there was no direct evidence. No eyewitness. No confession. No forensic proof tying him to the act itself. The trial of Scott Peterson began in 2004 and became one of the most closely watched proceedings in modern American criminal history. The prosecution leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence. The affair, the lies, the marina trip, the recorded calls, the anchors, the body's location. After months of testimony, the jury found Scott guilty of first-degree murder for Laci and second-degree murder for their unborn son. He was sentenced to death in 2005. Years later, that sentence would be overturned and reduced to life without parole. Appeals would continue. Questions would linger in some corners of the public. But for most, the case felt closed. Until the digital age began reshaping how people examine the past. Because long after the trial, something unexpected happened. Old photographs resurfaced. Archived interviews were clipped and reposted. And eventually, on platforms that didn't even exist in 2002, platforms like Facebook, communities formed around one question. Was every clue truly examined? Or were there details buried beneath the noise? What started as a suburban disappearance had already transformed into a national obsession. But the second life of the case, its digital resurrection, would introduce new voices, new theories, and a new battleground for truth. And in that world, screenshots became evidence. Posts became timelines. And the past refused to stay buried. By the time social media matured into a global force, the Laci Peterson case had already been tried, televised, debated, and archived. Court transcripts were public. News footage was digitized. Old headlines became searchable. And for a new generation raised on timelines and threads, the case wasn't history. It was content. On Facebook, groups began forming, some with thousands of members, others with tens of thousands. Their names varied: Justice for Laci. Scott Peterson is innocent. Reopen the case. Each group operated like a digital courtroom. Every post was an argument. Every comment a counterpoint. What separated this era from 2004 was access. Trial exhibits that once required courthouse visits could now be downloaded. Witness testimony could be clipped into shareable videos. Google Earth allowed users to retrace routes from Modesto to Berkeley Marina with satellite precision. The case became interactive. And with that interactivity came reinterpretation. Supporters of Scott Peterson focused on what they saw as weaknesses in the prosecution's timeline. They dissected the medical examiner's reports. They debated tidal patterns in the San Francisco Bay. They analyzed the exact dates and movements of currents to question whether the bodies could have drifted to where they were found if Scott had disposed of them on December 24. Charts were posted. Screenshots shared. Links archived. Some members pointed to eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen Laci walking her dog after Scott had already left for the marina. They argued those sightings were dismissed too quickly. They compiled names, times, locations, and weather reports. They asked why alternative suspects, like burglars reported in the neighborhood, weren't pursued more aggressively. On the other side, critics responded with their own digital binders. They posted transcripts of the recorded phone calls between Scott and Amber Fry. They highlighted inconsistencies in his statements to police. They revisited the purchase of the boat, the fishing license, the concrete anchors. They shared photos of the marina and circled the precise location where Scott said he launched his boat, near where Laci's remains eventually surfaced. The debate intensified. But then something changed. Facebook's structure allowed more than just discussion. It allowed networking. Amateur investigators connected across states and even across continents. Retired law enforcement officers joined groups. Law students dissected procedural rulings. Data enthusiasts ran their own tide simulations. In 2017, the case gained renewed attention when the California Supreme Court agreed to review aspects of Scott's appeal. Facebook groups exploded with activity. Posts that had once received a few dozen comments now drew thousands. Every development in the appeals process was shared in real time. When the California Supreme Court overturned Scott's death sentence in 2020 due to jury selection issues, while upholding the conviction, Facebook became a digital battlefield. Some claimed it proved the original trial was flawed. Others insisted the conviction remained solid and supported by overwhelming evidence. But beyond opinion, something else was happening. Information was being organized. Documents were being archived in centralized group files. Timelines were reconstructed minute by minute. Members compiled side-by-side comparisons of Scott's statements over time. What he told police. What he told Amber. What he told the media. Patterns emerged more clearly when laid out visually. For example, Scott's statement that he had decided to go fishing that morning because it was too cold to golf. Members pulled weather reports from December 24, 2002. They posted historical data showing it was a mild California winter day. Another example, the claim that Laci may have confronted burglars across the street. Facebook users tracked the reported burglary timeline. Police records indicated the burglary occurred on December 26, 2 days after Laci disappeared. That detail, buried in early reporting, resurfaced repeatedly in online discussions. Screenshots of original police press releases were posted to counter rumors. In a strange way, Facebook became a fact-checking engine. But it was also a rumor amplifier. False claims spread quickly. Some posts alleged secret evidence suppressed at trial. Others suggested conspiracies involving media bias or political pressure. Moderators struggled to contain misinformation. Debates grew heated. People were banned. New groups formed. Yet amid the noise, certain digital breadcrumbs mattered. One recurring thread involved the location where the bodies were discovered. Users overlaid marina maps with tide charts. They calculated drift patterns using publicly available oceanographic data. While experts had testified during trial about currents, social media allowed thousands to see and debate those calculations themselves. The conclusion most often reached echoed the prosecution's original argument. The recovery location aligned closely with the area where Scott admitted launching his boat. The visual impact of those overlays, shared, reshared, and commented on, made the connection feel immediate, not abstract. Another powerful element was video. Old courtroom footage circulated widely. Viewers watched Scott's expressions as Amber's recorded calls played for the jury. They slowed clips down. They analyzed body language frame by frame. Some claimed he looked detached. Others argued he appeared overwhelmed. But the repetition mattered. For many who hadn't followed the 2004 trial live, Facebook became their first exposure to the full scope of evidence. Instead of a single news segment, they consumed hours of testimony at their own pace. And perception shifted again. In 2022, when the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced it was reviewing Scott's case, Facebook groups reignited with intensity. Supporters saw validation. Critics demanded transparency. Every court filing was uploaded within minutes of becoming public. Yet as legal arguments unfolded, one thing remained unchanged. No new physical evidence directly contradicted the original jury's findings. Instead, what Facebook ultimately provided was clarity through aggregation. Not a hidden confession. Not a secret witness. But context. It showed how the affair predated the disappearance. How Scott told Amber he had lost his wife weeks before Laci vanished. How he described himself as a widower before becoming one. Those details, when isolated, could feel like character flaws. When compiled chronologically on a scrolling timeline, they felt like preparation. By the time the trial court reconsidered aspects of jury selection and reaffirmed the conviction, the online world had already conducted its own parallel review. And for many watching from the United States, Europe, and beyond, the case had transformed from a headline into a digital case study. It wasn't just about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about how truth survives in the age of algorithms. Because in 2002, information moved through nightly news broadcasts. In the Facebook era, it moved through shares. And sometimes the crowd sees patterns that individuals miss. But crowds can also see what they want to see. The question was no longer just what happened to Laci Peterson. It was whether the digital age had strengthened the case against her husband, or fractured it beyond repair. As Chapter 3 approaches, the final reckoning isn't about evidence alone. It's about whether justice, once decided, can ever truly rest in a world that never stops refreshing. By the time the appeals process stretched into its second decade, the Laci Peterson case no longer belonged solely to the courtroom. It lived online. What had once been sealed inside binders and evidence lockers now circulated through servers and smartphones. The question of guilt had been answered by a jury in 2004. The question of punishment had been adjusted by higher courts. But the question that refused to disappear was quieter and more persistent. Was everything examined? When the California Supreme Court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence in 2020 due to issues involving jury selection, while upholding his conviction, it reignited global attention. Headlines traveled instantly across the United States and into Europe. Social media feeds filled with renewed debate. To some, the decision reinforced that the justice system had worked properly. To others, it suggested cracks beneath the surface. The legal reasoning was procedural, not evidentiary. The conviction remained intact. The jury's finding of guilt stood firm. Still, in the digital age, nuance rarely slows momentum. Online communities dissected the ruling line by line. Legal analysts uploaded breakdowns explaining why the penalty phase differed from the guilt phase. Court documents were shared within minutes of publication. People who had never visited Modesto, never stood in a California courtroom, now felt personally invested. And yet, beneath the noise, something steady remained. The evidence presented at trial had not fundamentally changed. The prosecution's case had always been circumstantial. There was no eyewitness to the act. No recorded confession. No forensic bloodstain tying Scott directly to violence inside the home. Instead, there was a web of timing, behavior, geography, and deception. The affair that began weeks before Laci vanished. The statement to Amber that this would be his first Christmas without a wife. The spontaneous fishing trip to a marina far from home. The purchase of a boat few people knew about. The homemade anchors. The bodies discovered near the same waters he visited that morning. Individually, each detail might have felt explainable. Together, the jury concluded, they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. In 2021, the trial court reconsidered certain juror-related issues and reaffirmed the conviction. Once again, the legal system signaled that while procedures may be reviewed, the foundation of the case remained intact. But public opinion does not move only through court orders. Documentaries revisited the story. Podcasts reconstructed timelines episode by episode. Streaming platforms introduced the case to viewers who had been children, or not yet born, when Laci disappeared. Each retelling layered new interpretation over old facts. Some narratives emphasized media bias in the early days of the investigation. Others focused on the pressure surrounding a pregnant victim during the holidays. A few explored whether pretrial publicity influenced jurors in ways difficult to measure. Through it all, one element endured: the quiet image of a missing woman whose absence began the entire chain of events. Laci Peterson was 27 years old. She was weeks away from giving birth. Her family described her as hopeful, organized, and deeply invested in the future she was building. In the swirl of arguments about tides and transcripts, it was easy to forget that the case began not with controversy, but with loss. The discovery of her remains in April 2003 closed one chapter of uncertainty. It also shifted the case from missing person to homicide. The location of that discovery, within the same body of water tied to Scott's alibi, remained one of the prosecution's most powerful anchors. Over time, as technology advanced, some wondered whether new forensic methods might alter conclusions. Yet no breakthrough DNA evidence emerged to redirect suspicion elsewhere. No alternate suspect was charged. No confession surfaced to overturn the narrative established in court. The appeals process, lengthy and methodical, continued to examine claims of juror misconduct, evidentiary rulings, and procedural fairness. That process by design moves slowly. It exists not to satisfy public debate but to test the stability of a verdict. And so far, that verdict has held. Meanwhile, the digital conversation evolved. Early Facebook debates gave way to broader platforms, to video essays, to algorithm-driven recommendations that pushed the case into new audiences. Each share kept the story alive. Each comment extended its lifespan. But something else happened too. As years passed, intensity softened. The outrage of the early 2000s faded into archival interest. For younger viewers, the case became a study in how circumstantial evidence can secure a conviction. For legal scholars, it offered lessons about jury selection in high-profile trials. For media analysts, it demonstrated the power and risk of 24-hour news cycles. For Laci's family, it remained personal. Grief does not evolve with technology. It does not refresh with each notification. It endures quietly outside comment sections. Scott Peterson now serves life without the possibility of parole. The death sentence once imposed no longer stands, but the conviction remains. He maintains his innocence. The courts maintain their ruling. And somewhere between those positions lies the enduring tension of the case, the space between legal certainty and public doubt. True crime stories often promise closure. Arrest, trial, sentence. But some cases refuse to settle neatly. Not because the verdict changes, but because the conversation never truly stops. In the end, what solved the case was not Facebook. It was not a viral thread or a digital overlay of tide charts. The case was built in interrogation rooms, courtrooms, forensic labs, and long hours of investigative work. What Facebook did was something different. It reopened the file in the court of public opinion. It allowed thousands to step into the role of juror long after the original 12 had spoken. It turned archived evidence into living debate. It transformed a 2002 disappearance into a case study for the algorithm age. And perhaps that is the lasting legacy of the Laci Peterson case. Not just the tragedy of what happened. Not just the verdict delivered. But the realization that in the modern world, justice is no longer discussed once. It is discussed endlessly. Refreshed. Reposted. Re-examined. Until even the quietest suburban street can echo across decades. And the question that began on a cold Christmas Eve morning, what happened inside that house, continues to ripple outward, long after the courtroom doors have closed.